Grayson Marsh had never been one for crowds, rules, or anyone telling him what to do with his own two hands. A former structural engineer in a high-stakes corporate world, he had spent years designing skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, bridges that defied gravity, and industrial facilities that ran smoother than clockwork. He was brilliant at his craft, methodical and patient, but as his career grew, so did the weight on his shoulders, the boardroom bureaucracy, the suffocating meetings, and the relentless egos that surrounded him. By the time he turned 50, Grayson had decided he was done with all of it. He sold his shares, packed up his life, and set his sights on a quieter, simpler existence. He bought a property on the far edge of an upscale suburban community, a plot of land carved out between sprawling lawns and identical homes, where he intended to build something that was entirely his own. For Grayson, the land represented more than just a fresh start. It was a canvas, a place where his architectural dreams could take on a personal meaning, free from clients, investors, or constraints. The house that came with the property was a modest one-story structure, sturdy but unremarkable, tucked into a corner lot that backed up to a line of tall pines. It was the kind of house that blended into the neighborhood unnoticed, just the way Grayson liked it. But his real focus wasn't on the house itself, it was the land. For months, Grayson had been sketching plans for a personal workshop and storage shed, a space where he could finally work with his hands instead of a keyboard. It was to be a beautifully functional structure, designed with the precision he had honed during his career. Every detail was intentional: durable materials, eco-friendly insulation, a rainwater collection system, and modular storage. A place to store his tools, work on small carpentry projects, and lose himself in the methodical rhythm of creation. Grayson's designs were practical, but they were also elegant, a quiet nod to his years of expertise. The idea of turning this patch of suburban earth into something meaningful felt like a small triumph in a life that had often felt hijacked by other people's agendas. But not everyone appreciated creativity in the same way Grayson did, and that was something he discovered almost immediately upon moving into the neighborhood. When he first introduced himself at the community HOA meeting and event, he only attended to be polite. He noticed the subtle glances exchanged between residents as he described his plans. "A workshop?" a woman named Cynthia Preston asked, arching a carefully manicured eyebrow. "That sounds like quite the undertaking." Cynthia was the head of the HOA, a position she wore like a badge of honor, and she ruled the community with the careful diplomacy of a queen who never raised her voice, but whose word was law. Grayson shrugged off her tone at the time. He had no interest in getting tangled up in neighborhood politics. To him, the HOA was just another bureaucratic relic, the kind of thing that appealed to people with too much free time and too little imagination. He didn't see them as an obstacle, just a formality, a box to check, some paperwork to file. He submitted his project proposal to the HOA office within a week of moving in, complete with blueprints, permits, and a detailed outline of materials. Grayson knew the process inside and out. In his line of work, approval boards and zoning committees were second nature. To him, it seemed like a no-brainer. But weeks passed without so much as a courtesy email, and each time he called to follow up, the HOA office gave him the same rehearsed response: "It's under review." At first, Grayson assumed it was simple inefficiency, something he could forgive, having worked with plenty of slow-moving committees in his day. But the longer it dragged on, the more it felt deliberate, as though someone was stalling on purpose. His calls began to go unanswered, his voicemails unreturned. When he finally visited the office in person, he was told that Cynthia Preston was out of town indefinitely and that no decisions could be made until her return. Frustrated but determined, Grayson decided to proceed with the first phase of his workshop anyway. He had followed every regulation to the letter. There was no reason to stop. He broke ground on a brisk Monday morning, hauling tools and materials from his garage to the edge of his property, where the structure would sit, nestled against the tree line. The sound of his saw, the rhythmic pounding of a hammer, these were the only sounds that mattered to him. He worked long into the evenings, his hands blistered and aching, but it was a good kind of pain. The project gave him purpose, a kind of clarity he hadn't felt in years. But as the days passed, Grayson began to notice things. It started small neighbors pausing just a little too long as they walked their dogs, glancing at his worksite with poorly disguised curiosity. Cars slowed as they passed his house, heads turning to get a better look. Then came the notes. Folded slips of paper left in his mailbox with no return address. Not everyone appreciates noise around here. This isn't an industrial zone. Keep it down, or there'll be consequences. Grayson ignored them at first, dismissing them as passive-aggressive nonsense from neighbors with nothing better to do. But the notes didn't stop. If anything, they became more pointed. One evening, as Grayson was packing up his tools, he caught sight of someone standing near the edge of his property, half hidden by the trees. It was too dark to make out a face, but the silhouette stood still for an uncomfortably long time before finally turning and disappearing into the woods. That night, Grayson sat on his back porch, staring into the blackness beyond the tree line, his gut telling him something was wrong. He wasn't a paranoid man by nature. Years of engineering had taught him to trust facts, not feelings. But there was a tension in the air he couldn't shake. For the first time, he wondered if his project as escape was turning into something else entirely. The next morning, he woke to find his lumber pile knocked over, boards scattered across the grass like they'd been thrown. A deep gouge ran through the dirt where someone had dragged something heavy across the lot. Grayson crouched down, staring at the marks, his mind racing. This wasn't kids playing pranks. This was intentional. And whoever had done it wanted him to know they'd been there. The morning air was cool when Grayson Marsh walked out to survey the damage. The lumber that had been stacked neatly the day before was now strewn haphazardly across his lot, some planks split and others dented like someone had taken a heavy boot to them. Sawdust from an open bag was scattered across the ground, as if deliberately kicked into the dirt. Grayson stood still for a long moment, the breath in his chest heavy and slow. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this wasn't an accident. Someone had been here. Someone who wanted him to stop. He crouched down and ran his hand along one of the boards, the splintered edge sharp beneath his fingers. Footprints, two distinct sets, marked the soft soil nearby, leading from the tree line to the construction site and back again. He traced their path with his eyes, his jaw tightening with every step he imagined. Grayson had dealt with plenty of difficult people over the course of his life: headstrong developers, unreasonable clients, ego-driven supervisors, but this was something different. This was personal. The thought made his skin prickle. He glanced toward the street. Everything looked the same as always: perfectly manicured lawns, houses with matching shutters, a jogger moving past with headphones on, oblivious. On the surface, the neighborhood was the picture of quiet civility, but Grayson felt the undercurrent now, something ugly rippling just beneath the polished exterior. He collected the scattered wood one board at a time, refusing to let the frustration seep through his movements. If someone thought they could intimidate him into stopping, they'd picked the wrong man. An hour later, he loaded the damaged planks into his truck and drove to the hardware store. While the clerk helped him load replacements, Grayson couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. It was the same back at the house. He would catch glimpses of curtains shifting ever so slightly when he glanced up at the windows across the street, or a car parked too long a little further down the block. It wasn't overt, just enough to let him know he was being watched. He tried to focus on his work, determined to tune it all out. The next disruption came 2 days later. He'd just finished laying the foundation posts for the workshop when a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of his driveway. Grayson straightened, brushing the dirt from his jeans as he watched Cynthia Preston step out of the car. She looked as polished as ever, her hair swept back into a tight, no-nonsense bun, a folder tucked neatly under her arm. Behind her oversized sunglasses, her mouth twisted into a polite smile that didn't reach her face. Grayson didn't move to greet her. He just waited, his hands resting on his hips as she crossed the lawn in her pristine beige heels. "Good afternoon, Mr. Marsh," she said, her tone clipped and professional. She gestured vaguely to the construction site behind him. "I see you've been busy." "Busy enough," Grayson replied, not bothering to soften his voice. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Preston?" Her smile sharpened as she tilted her head slightly, like she was addressing a misbehaving student. "I'm here to discuss your project. There have been concerns raised by the community about what you're building." "Concerns?" Grayson repeated, his brows knitting together. I've submitted all the required plans. Everything's compliant with your regulations." "I'm afraid that's not entirely true," Cynthia said smoothly, flipping open her folder. "According to our most recent review, your structure is in violation of several HOA guidelines. For one, it exceeds the maximum allowable height for auxiliary buildings by approximately 2 feet. Additionally, it's too close to the property line, and there's been no formal noise variance request approved for your use of heavy tools." Grayson's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "That's nonsense. The plans I submitted were approved by the county. The measurements are exact. If there was an issue, you should have told me weeks ago." Cynthia raised her chin slightly, the smugness in her expression impossible to miss. "We're simply doing our duty to uphold the standards of this community, Mr. Marsh. I'm sure you can appreciate the importance of preserving property values. I'll be delivering a formal cease and desist notice later this afternoon." Grayson felt his patience unraveling. "And what if I don't stop? What if I keep building?" Her smile thinned into something almost predatory. "Then the HOA will have no choice but to pursue further action, including fines and potential legal measures. I'd hate to see things escalate unnecessarily." She turned on her heel before he could respond, striding back toward her sub without another word. Grayson stood there, fists still clenched as he watched the vehicle disappear around the corner. "Escalate unnecessarily." The words grated on him, the condescension in her voice replaying over and over in his mind. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, like he was an intruder in his own life. He knew how people like Cynthia operated. They didn't like outsiders. They didn't like someone who refused to play by their rules, especially when those rules were a moving target. The cease and desist letter arrived later that day, just as promised, typed in stiff legal jargon and delivered by hand to his doorstep. Grayson read it twice, feeling his frustration build with every line. Violations. Fines. Threats of legal action. It was ridiculous, every last word of it. The workshop wasn't hurting anyone. It was tucked into the back corner of his property, barely visible from the street. But HOA regulations had always been about control more than anything else, and now Grayson had made himself a target. He set the letter aside and went back to work. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, he was tightening the final bolts on a crossbeam when he heard a sharp metallic clink, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Grayson turned sharply, his heart slamming against his ribs as he scanned the yard. At first he didn't see anything, but then his gaze caught a faint glint of movement in the distance, someone slipping between the trees, disappearing into the shadows. He rushed toward the edge of his property, but by the time he reached it, they were gone. He looked down to see what had shattered, the floodlight on the corner of his garage, now just shards of glass scattered across the pavement. Grayson stayed outside for a long time that night, staring into the trees, listening to the stillness. This wasn't kids. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone was escalating. He could feel it in his bones. His project, his quiet attempt to carve out something for himself, had somehow become a declaration of war. He didn't know how far they were willing to go, but the warning signs were all there. The following morning, Grayson Marsh was already up before dawn, leaning against his kitchen counter with a cup of black coffee, staring out the window at the darkened outline of his property. He hadn't slept much. Every sound, every creak, had him half out of bed, on edge. Whoever had shattered the floodlight the night before had left a message, whether they meant to or not. It wasn't just about stopping his workshop anymore. This was intimidation, plain and simple. Grayson had seen this kind of bullying before in the corporate world, people leveraging power not through skill or merit, but by instilling fear. The only difference was that here, in this pristine suburban nightmare, the rules were written to make men like him out to be the problem. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, Grayson was already out back surveying the workshop site. The skeletal structure of the building still stood proud despite everything, an unfinished but defiant monument to his own resolve. He gathered the shards of glass from the shattered floodlight into a small box, running his thumb over one particularly jagged edge, as though it might tell him who had been there in the dark. Then, with the same measured determination that had carried him through years of engineering projects, he picked up his tools and got to work. He wasn't going to stop, not for Cynthia Preston, not for her HOA lackeys, not for whoever thought sneaking onto his property in the dead of night made them powerful. By mid-morning, Grayson had nearly lost himself in the familiar rhythm of the work, the satisfying thud of the hammer, the metallic buzz of the drill when a new sound broke through, the low rumble of an engine, accompanied by the sharp crunch of tires on gravel. Grayson paused, straightening, as he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. A white utility truck, unmarked but brand new, was rolling to a stop at the curb in front of his house. Two men stepped out, both dressed in matching blue uniforms with clipboards tucked under their arms. Grayson's gut tightened. He didn't recognize either of them. One was tall and lean, with a sharp face and a permanent scowl. The other was shorter and rounder, his expression hard to read behind dark sunglasses. "Mr. Marsh?" the tall one called out as they approached, his voice just a little too loud, too formal. Grayson nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "Building inspection team," the man replied, holding up a laminated ID badge. "We're here to assess your construction site. You received the notice, didn't you?" Grayson frowned. "What notice?" The shorter man gave a slight shrug, as though he couldn't care less. "We sent it through the HOA office yesterday afternoon. Should have been in your mailbox. Says here you're in violation of municipal codes. Unapproved structure. Possible safety hazards." He gestured vaguely toward the half-finished workshop. Grayson's jaw clenched. "That's impossible. I have all the permits from the county. Everything here is up to code." "Be that as it may," the tall man said, his tone shifting into something clipped and disinterested, "we're required to complete a preliminary inspection to confirm compliance. Shouldn't take too long." Without waiting for Grayson's approval, the two men began moving past him toward the site. "Hey," Grayson barked, stepping forward to block their path. "You don't set foot on my property unless I see the paperwork first." The tall man stopped, just long enough to give Grayson a look, one that straddled the line between pity and condescension. "Mr. Marsh, refusing an inspection could result in formal citations or fines. It's your call, but I don't think you want to escalate this further." Grayson stood frozen, fists curled at his sides as the two men continued toward the workshop. His instincts screamed that something about this was off. Everything about them, from the truck to their uniforms, felt too polished, too convenient. He didn't recognize the badges they'd flashed, and the supposed notice they mentioned was nowhere to be found. But what could he do? Call the police? They wouldn't care. Two men with clipboards weren't exactly breaking any laws. So Grayson watched, every muscle in his body coiled tight, as the inspectors poked and prodded at his worksite. They measured beams, scribbled notes onto their clipboards, and murmured to each other just loud enough for Grayson to hear words, like structural instability and safety violations. After what felt like an eternity, they returned to where Grayson stood waiting. The shorter man handed him a carbon copy of a citation notice, at least. That's what they claimed it was. "You'll receive an official report within 48 hours, he said. "In the meantime, all work on this site needs to cease until further notice." "You've got to be kidding me," Grayson growled, snatching the paper and glaring at the neatly typed violations. "This is ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with this build, and you know it." "Take it up with the county," the tall man replied with a shrug. "We're just doing our jobs." They turned and left without another word, climbing back into their truck and disappearing down the street as quickly as they'd arrived. Grayson stood there for a long time, his mind racing. The citation notice in his hand felt flimsy, almost fake, but the consequences it threatened were very real. A stop work order, mandatory re-inspections, and escalating fines for non-compliance. Grayson didn't need anyone to tell him who was behind this. Cynthia Preston, the HOA, the people who didn't want him here in the first place. By the time night fell, Grayson's frustration had boiled into something darker, something closer to anger. He spent the evening pacing his living room, replaying every moment of the day in his mind. The inspectors, the truck, the smug way they'd acted like they had all the power in the world. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the HOA was testing him, probing for weaknesses to see how far they could push before he broke. Well, he wouldn't break. He wouldn't stop. Grayson had spent his entire career solving problems, building things that other people said couldn't be done. If Cynthia and her cronies wanted a fight, they'd get one. The next morning, Grayson grabbed his keys and drove straight to the county building department. He spent hours waiting in lines, bouncing from one office to another, only to confirm what he already knew: there were no municipal violations. The inspection notice wasn't legitimate. It hadn't come from the county at all. It was a bluff, a fabricated threat. Grayson's anger crystallized into resolve as he drove home. They wanted to scare him off, bury him under paperwork and intimidation. But now he had something they didn't: proof. Proof that they were overstepping. As Grayson pulled into his driveway that afternoon, he noticed something strange: a manila envelope taped to his front door. He climbed out of his truck and grabbed it, ripping it open as he stepped inside. The envelope contained a single photograph, glossy and freshly printed. It showed Grayson standing outside his half-built workshop, hammer in hand. The photo had been taken from a distance, as though someone had been watching him through the trees. At the bottom of the photo, scrawled in thick black marker, were 3 words: "This isn't over." By the time Grayson Marsh pulled the photo from the manila envelope and stared at the ominous scrawl beneath it, "This isn't over," the undercurrent of hostility had officially turned into something far more calculated. He had known since day one that the HOA and its queen bee, Cynthia Preston, didn't want him here. But this was deliberate. A threat. Not the passive-aggressive kind delivered through cease and desist letters or phony citations. This was the kind of message that made your gut turn cold. Someone had stood just beyond his tree line, camera in hand, and waited for the right moment to capture him. Someone had been on his land, watching him work like a predator. Grayson sank onto his couch, the photo still clutched in his hand, his pulse steady but heavy. Every instinct he'd honed in decades of high-pressure engineering work told him this was a test in escalation designed to push him into a corner and force him to react. But Grayson didn't make rash decisions. He was a man of plans, of blueprints and contingencies, and this wouldn't shake him. It couldn't. They wanted him rattled, scared, intimidated into stopping his project. If they thought a shadowy photo and a few words scrawled in marker could break him, then they didn't know him at all. But as the day wore on, the pressure on his mind didn't relent. He kept glancing at the photograph, the grainy resolution almost making it worse, as though the facelessness of whoever had taken it made them everywhere and nowhere at once. By late afternoon, Grayson made up his mind: if the HOA and their loyalists wanted to play dirty, he'd be ready for them. He drove into town and stopped at a hardware store, purchasing a set of high-end trail cameras. Small, camouflaged, and designed for wildlife surveillance, they'd be perfect for monitoring his property without being detected. He also picked up additional floodlights, motion sensors, and a box of heavy-duty padlocks for his tool sheds and garage. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself as he loaded the supplies into his truck. It was preparation. They had made the first move, now it was his turn. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Grayson worked quickly and quietly. He positioned the trail cameras at strategic points around the property, one in the branches of an old pine facing the workshop site, another near the back fence where the footprints had been found, and 2 more covering the side yard and his driveway. Each camera was synced to a small monitor in his home office, where Grayson could review the footage. He installed the floodlights around the perimeter and wired the motion sensors to trigger them. When it was done, he stood at the edge of his property and watched as the first sensor tripped, bathing the workshop in brilliant white light. Satisfied, he turned back toward the house, the weight on his shoulders easing ever so slightly. Grayson slept better that night, deep and dreamless, for the first time in weeks. But the following morning, when he checked the camera footage over his first cup of coffee, he felt his stomach tighten into a knot. At 2:37 a.m., one of the cameras had picked up movement near the back fence. The figure appeared only briefly, a silhouette cloaked in darkness, just visible against the faint glow of the floodlights. Whoever it was had kept low, moving with deliberate care, as though they knew exactly where to avoid detection. For a split second, the figure turned toward the camera, and though their face was obscured, the reflective flash of something glasses perhaps caught the light. Then they vanished back into the trees, leaving only the faint sway of branches in their wake. Grayson replayed the footage half a dozen times, memorizing every detail. This wasn't just some teenager pulling a prank. The way the figure moved, it was purposeful, practiced. He'd seen that kind of movement before in his career, when contractors inspected job sites at night to avoid unwanted attention. This wasn't about the workshop anymore. This was someone trying to make him feel hunted. He spent the next few hours going through his property, checking for any signs of tampering. His tools were still locked in place, the materials untouched. The workshop frame stood tall, defying the chaos swirling around it, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. As Grayson stood beneath it, his eyes scanning the lot, a realization settled in his mind like a stone in his gut. This was a war of attrition. They wanted to wear him down, to keep him on edge, to make him question every shadow, every sound, until he had no choice but to pack up and leave. Later that day, Grayson paid a visit to the HOA office, walking in with a quiet fury that made the receptionist's forced cheer falter. "I need to speak to Cynthia Preston," he said flatly. The receptionist stammered, claiming Cynthia was unavailable, but Grayson's glare silenced any further excuses. After a long, uncomfortable pause, the receptionist disappeared into a back room, and minutes later, Cynthia emerged, immaculate as ever, her expression neutral but guarded. "Mr. Marsh," she said coolly, folding her hands in front of her. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know exactly why I'm here," Grayson shot back, holding up the photograph. "Someone's been on my property. Someone's been watching me. I don't suppose you'd know anything about that?" Cynthia's lips twitched into something like a smile, though it held no warmth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marsh, but I'm afraid I can't help you. The HOA doesn't involve itself in personal disputes between neighbors." "Disputes?" Grayson repeated, his voice low and sharp. "This isn't a dispute. It's harassment. You've got people sneaking onto my land, breaking my equipment, and sending me garbage like this." He shook the photo for emphasis. "And don't think for a second I don't know you're behind it." Cynthia's smile didn't waver. "I'd watch those accusations if I were you. Without proof, you're only making yourself look unreasonable. And from what I hear, that's becoming something of a pattern." Grayson's teeth ground together, his blood simmering as Cynthia turned her back on him and walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the HOA office with the photograph crumpled in his hand. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the glass. That night, Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the flickering monitor displaying the live feeds from his trail cameras. He felt trapped in his own home, boxed in by invisible lines of control he hadn't seen when he first bought the property. The HOA had turned the entire neighborhood against him, twisting facts and spinning stories until he was the villain in their carefully crafted narrative. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his focus. It was an unknown number. He stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, just faint, crackling static. Then, a low, distorted voice spoke. "Stop building, Mr. Marsh. It's not worth it." The call ended before Grayson could respond, leaving him gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He set it down slowly, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until someone made it stop. But if they thought he'd be the one to fold first, they were dead wrong. Grayson turned back to the monitor and watched the screens late into the night, the glow of the cameras reflecting in his tired eyes. The floodlights blazed on intermittently, cutting through the darkness in sharp bursts, but nothing moved. Still, Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light, waiting for him to make a mistake. Grayson Marsh had never been one to back down, but by the time the second escalation began, he could feel the weight of his resolve grinding against his shoulders, like a steel beam waiting to snap. The silent phone calls came every night now, always at odd hours, always a brief crackle of static or a low, deliberate silence before the line went dead. Whoever was on the other end wasn't trying to scare him anymore. They were trying to exhaust him, to seep into his mind like a rot that spread deeper the longer it lingered. The cameras he had set up continued to capture Shadow's movements just at the edge of visibility. A figure in the woods at midnight. a car idling for too long at the curb. Grayson had been meticulous in his setup, placing every camera where he thought it counted, and yet they always managed to slip just beyond the frame, as if they knew exactly how to evade him. What troubled him more was that nothing had happened to the workshop since the inspection team had arrived. The structure stood untouched, almost as if they were leaving it there on purpose, a reminder that the war wasn't over, that it had simply moved to a quieter, more insidious level. One morning, Grayson found another envelope taped to his garage door. This time, there was no photograph, just a formal-looking letterhead stamped with the HOA logo. He ripped it open and scanned the message, his eyes narrowing at the neat rows of bureaucratic nonsense. The letter claimed that he was being fined $5,000 for prolonged construction, causing a disruption to neighborhood order and aesthetics. A disruption. The word hung in his mind like an echo, reverberating into something uglier. He'd followed every regulation. The build wasn't loud, he rarely worked past sundown, and the structure was barely visible from the street. Yet here it was, their next move calculated in cold. Grayson stormed into the HOA office later that day. He didn't bother to check in with the receptionist, pushing through the glass doors and heading straight for Cynthia Preston's office. She was there, seated behind her oversized mahogany desk like some minor royalty, a smug look on her face the moment he entered. "Mr. Marsh," she said smoothly, as if she'd been expecting him. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need an appointment to deal with extortion," Grayson shot back, slamming the fine letter onto her desk. $5,000. For what? You people are making it up as you go along now. Cynthia didn't flinch. She laced her fingers together and regarded him with the same detached calm that made his skin crawl. "I assure you, Mr. Marsh, the fine is entirely legitimate. The HOA board has received numerous complaints about the noise, the appearance of your project, and the general disruption it's caused. As per our bylaws, fines are assessed when a homeowner refuses to address concerns raised by the community." "What concerns?" Grayson demanded, his voice sharp. "The sound of a hammer? The sight of a damn workshop? You know as well as I do this isn't about bylaws. This is about you wanting me gone." Cynthia's smile flickered, as though his accusation hit closer to the mark than she wanted to admit. "If you truly believe that, Mr. Marsh, I'd advise you to bring it up with the board at our next meeting. I'm sure they'd be happy to hear your side." She said it like she was daring him, like she knew exactly how the meeting would go and relished the thought of him standing there while her loyalists tore him apart. Grayson didn't respond. He simply turned on his heel and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind him hard enough to shake the picture frames on the wall. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling of whatever piece he had left. The fine letter was just the beginning. Someone, he was sure it was one of Cynthia's loyal neighbors, filed a noise complaint with the county, which resulted in a visit from a sheriff's deputy who couldn't have been more disinterested in the case. "Just keep it down after dark," the deputy said with a shrug, as if that would solve everything. Grayson didn't bother arguing. It wasn't worth the breath. But it wasn't just the authorities. The sabotage started up again, this time in small, insidious ways that chipped at Grayson's patience like water eroding stone. One morning he woke to find his garden hose sliced clean through, the two halves lying uselessly in the dirt. A few days later, his truck tires had been deflated, not punctured, just emptied, forcing him to spend hours getting them refilled. Then came the worst of it. Grayson had just finished securing the last of the roofing beams on the workshop when he noticed something odd out of the corner of his eye. A dead bird nailed to the wooden crossbeam by its wing. Grayson froze. The bird, an ordinary black crow, was limp and lifeless, its feathers ruffled where it had been crudely handled. His stomach turned as he stepped closer. Someone had gone out of their way to climb onto his structure and leave it there, a message as grotesque as it was personal. Grayson took it down with trembling hands, the weight of the tiny creature far heavier than it should have been. He buried it beneath the pines at the back of the property, but the image stayed with him, seared into his mind. He knew now that they weren't just trying to intimidate him, they wanted to push him over the edge, make him lash out, make him look unstable, unreasonable, dangerous. The thought made his blood run hot, and that night, As he sat in his darkened living room reviewing the latest footage from the cameras, he made a decision. If they wanted a war, he'd give them one. Grayson started by gathering every piece of evidence he had: the fake citations, the fine notices, the photographs, and the security footage. He compiled it all into a thick folder and spent hours writing a detailed statement that laid out every instance of harassment, every shadow caught on camera, every violation of his property. When it was done, he sent copies to his lawyer and the local zoning commission, filing formal complaints against the HOA for harassment and abuse of authority. But Grayson wasn't done yet. The next day, he went door to door, talking to his neighbors, those who hadn't openly turned against him, at least. He listened carefully, and what he heard only confirmed his suspicions. Others had been bullied by the HOA, too hit with fines for petty infractions, intimidated into selling their homes, driven to comply out of fear. One elderly neighbor, a soft-spoken man named Harold, admitted that Cynthia had fined him $1,000 last year for improper lawn maintenance. Another woman confessed that her son's treehouse had been torn down after a complaint was filed about its unsightly design. "This isn't just about you," Harold told Grayson quietly as they sat on his porch that afternoon. "She's been doing this for years. You're just the first one who hasn't backed down." Grayson nodded, his jaw set. "And I'm not going to." By the time night fell, Grayson was back on his property, reinforcing the cameras and double-checking every lock and light. He knew Cynthia and her crew would retaliate when they found out what he was doing, but this time he'd be ready. This time, he wasn't going to let them win. As he stood beneath the shadow of his unfinished workshop, the floodlights spilling stark white light across the lot, he felt something shift inside him, something hard and unyielding. They had tried to push him into a corner, but they'd underestimated him. They'd thought he was just another man they could bully into submission, another name on a list of people too afraid to fight back. They were wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night Grayson Marsh realized the war had reached its peak began in eerie stillness. The usual whispers of wind through the pines felt muted, the hum of suburban life strangely absent. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Grayson sat at his desk, poring over the compiled evidence he planned to present to the zoning commission and his lawyer in the coming days. The thick folder of documents was his shield, a meticulously constructed record of every violation, threat, and act of sabotage inflicted upon him. Yet, as complete as it was, he couldn't shake the sense that something worse was coming. Just past midnight, the motion sensor outside his workshop triggered, flooding the backyard with bright white light. Grayson stiffened, his eyes darting to the live feed on his monitor. There it was, a figure, partially obscured by shadows, lingering near the corner of the structure. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his breath sharp against the cold air. "Who's out there?" he barked, his voice carrying through the stillness. The figure froze but didn't retreat. Grayson could feel the tension radiating from the stranger even at a distance. Then, slowly, the figure stepped into the light. It wasn't Cynthia Preston or one of her loyalists. It was a man Grayson had never seen before, tall and wiry with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Get off my property," Grayson growled, gripping the flashlight tighter. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand slightly, as if to show he wasn't a threat, though the gesture only made Grayson more wary. Then the man spoke, his voice calm but unnervingly flat. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Marsh. They want you gone. Why not make it easy on yourself?" Grayson felt his jaw tighten. And who are they? Cynthia Preston? The HOA? "You tell them I'm not going anywhere." The man tilted his head, almost mockingly. "This isn't about the HOA anymore. You've drawn too much attention to yourself. It's not good for the neighborhood, and it's not good for you. Last warning, pack up and leave." Grayson's response was immediate and cold. "Get out, or I call the police." The man stared at him for a long moment, his presence almost ghost-like in its quiet menace. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the tree line, leaving Grayson's yard cloaked once again in heavy silence. Grayson retreated to the house, his nerves frayed but his determination intact. He reviewed the camera footage again, making sure every angle captured the man's face and movements. By morning, he'd have it sent to his lawyer and the police, though he knew neither would move quickly enough to matter. This wasn't the kind of fight that could be won through the usual channels. It was a siege, and he was the fortress. The following evening, the final escalation came. Grayson had spent most of the day reinforcing his workshop, hammering down every last nail, double-checking every bolt and beam. As night fell, a storm rolled in, heavy clouds swallowing the sky and wind hissing through the trees like a warning. The first raindrops had barely begun to fall when the power went out. Grayson grabbed a flashlight and moved through the house, checking the breaker box. Everything looked fine, no blown fuses, no signs of damage, but the power remained dead. He moved to the window, scanning the street. The rest of the neighborhood was still illuminated. This outage was targeted. His unease deepened. Then he heard the sharp crack of breaking wood. Grayson turned toward the sound, his heart pounding as he grabbed the heavy wrench he kept by the back door. He stepped outside into the storm, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Rain pelted his face as he made his way toward the workshop. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of 3 figures, dressed in dark clothing, was tearing at the structure with crowbars and hammers. They worked quickly and efficiently, ripping down beams and smashing supports. Grayson shouted, his voice booming over the storm, but they didn't stop. One of them turned briefly, and though his face was obscured, Grayson could see the smug defiance in his posture. Rage overtook him. Grayson charged toward the workshop, the wrench clenched tightly in his hand. The figures scattered, retreating into the woods like rats, their footsteps swallowed by the rain-soaked earth. By the time Grayson reached the structure, it was too late. Half the frame had been destroyed, the wood splintered and sagging. He stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking through his clothes, his fists trembling with frustration. They had finally done it. They had broken something he couldn't fix overnight. But as he stared at the wreckage, his anger hardened into something sharper, colder. They had made their move, but they'd underestimated him again. Grayson spent the rest of the night documenting the damage, taking photos and collecting debris. Among the rubble, he found something that sent a chill down his spine, a piece of paper, folded and weighted down by a rock. He unfolded it carefully, the rain smudging the ink but not enough to obscure the message, last warning. Leave, or we'll finish the job. The next morning, Grayson walked into the local police station with the folder of evidence in one hand and the paper in the other. He demanded to speak to someone in charge, refusing to leave until a detective agreed to take his case seriously. By the time he left, an investigation was officially underway, though Grayson knew better than to rely on it entirely. The culmination of weeks of harassment, sabotage, and threats had left Grayson battered but not broken. That evening, as the storm clouds cleared and the remnants of his workshop stood silhouetted against the fading light, Grayson made a silent vow. They wanted him out, but they'd have to drag him off this land kicking and screaming. He wasn't just fighting for his workshop anymore, he was fighting for his right to exist on his own terms. The war wasn't over, but the next battle would be his. The morning after the storm felt eerily calm, the air heavy with the residue of rain and tension. Grayson Marsh stood on his back porch, staring at the splintered remains of his workshop. The structure was beyond repair now, its skeletal frame leaning at a precarious angle, the surrounding ground littered with debris. Yet, as much as the sight of it stung, Grayson felt no despair. His anger had crystallized into something unshakable of final, immovable resolve. They had pushed him to the edge, but they hadn't won. Not yet. Grayson spent the next few days methodically gathering everything he needed to finish what he had started, not the workshop, but the fight. Every photograph, every piece of correspondence, every second of footage from his cameras was compiled into a massive dossier. He didn't stop at the physical evidence either. He reached out to the few neighbors who had shown quietly, asking if they had stories to share. Some were hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but others came forward with accounts of their own harassment at the hands of the HOA. Fines for trivial violations, threats of eviction over minor disputes, and even claims of property sabotage began to pile up, painting a damning picture of an organization that had long overstepped its bounds. By the end of the week, Grayson's lawyer filed a lawsuit against the HOA, citing harassment, property damage, and abuse of authority. Word of the suit spread quickly, and for the first time, cracks began to show in Cynthia Preston's impenetrable facade. She called an emergency HOA meeting to address the accusations, and though Grayson had no intention of attending, his lawyer insisted it was an opportunity to show the community who their real enemy was. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a pristine building that looked more like a luxury event space than a communal facility. Grayson arrived early, the folder of evidence tucked under his arm. The room filled quickly, the air thick with whispers and side glances as residents took their seats. Cynthia presided over the meeting like a queen at her court, her polished demeanor betraying no hint of the storm brewing beneath. When it came time for Grayson to speak, the room fell silent. He stood, his voice steady but cold, and laid out every piece of evidence he had gathered. The photos of the vandalism, the security footage of trespassers, the false citations, all of it was presented with the precision of a man who had built his career on details. Then came the stories from the neighbors, delivered through trembling voices or written statements, recounting years of fear and manipulation. Cynthia's mask began to crack. She tried to interrupt, to downplay the accusations as misunderstandings or isolated incidents, but Grayson silenced her with one final blow, a signed affidavit from a former HOA board member who had left under mysterious circumstances. The affidavit detailed the board's inner workings, including explicit instructions from Cynthia to target troublesome homeowners and force them to comply or leave. The room erupted. Residents who had remained silent out of fear now found their voices, shouting accusations and demands for Cynthia's resignation. She tried to maintain control, her voice rising in a rare display of anger, but it was no use. The board members who had once stood loyally by her side now looked away, unwilling to sync with her. In the days that followed, Cynthia Preston was removed from her position as HOA president, and a formal investigation into the organization was launched. Grayson's lawsuit gained traction, and it became clear that the HOA would be forced to settle. The neighborhood began to change, the fear that had once defined it slowly giving way to a cautious hope. For Grayson, the victory was bittersweet. His workshop was gone, and though the land was still his, it no longer felt like the sanctuary he had envisioned. He spent one last quiet morning walking the property, taking in the pines and the open sky, before packing his truck and leaving the neighborhood for good. He didn't feel defeated, far from it. What he had built here, though unfinished, had served its purpose. It wasn't just about a structure, it was about standing his ground, about proving to himself and others that even in the face of relentless pressure, some lines could not be crossed. Before he left, Grayson left a simple message for the neighborhood, etched into a small plaque he nailed to the stump of one of the destroyed workshop beams. Your land, your rules. Stand firm. It wasn't an act of defiance, it was a reminder, a quiet declaration that even if he was gone, the fight for respect and autonomy never really ended.